It's strange how often people who are actually making progress with money are the ones who feel like they're falling behind. Not because things are going badly, but because it doesn't feel the way they thought it would. You earn more than you used to. You've made better decisions. You're more careful, more intentional. And yet, the feeling you expected never really arrives. That sense of, okay, I'm doing well now. So this video isn't about money in the way it's usually talked about. It's not about numbers. It's not about income brackets. And it's definitely not about flexing or pretending everything's perfect. It's about the signs that matter before money actually feels good. Because most people assume that feeling rich comes first, and the evidence comes later. In reality, it's almost always the other way around. Here's the part most people don't realize. If you're doing things that actually make you wealthier in a real structural sense, it often feels boring, or slow, or slightly uncomfortable. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with quiet changes that don't look impressive from the outside, and don't feel impressive on the inside. So when people say, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere, what they usually mean is, I don't feel how I expected progress to feel. That disconnect causes a lot of people to give up too early, or to chase louder signals of success that don't actually improve their position. So before we go any further, we need to be clear about one thing. When I say getting rich, I don't mean lifestyle. I don't mean spending more. And I don't mean looking successful. I mean something much quieter. I mean building a life that slowly needs less from you to stay afloat. A life with fewer forced decisions. A life where money creates room instead of pressure. And if you're doing that, there are signs. They just don't show up the way social media says they should. So let's talk about the first one. Not as a checklist, not as advice, just as recognition. One of the earliest signs you're actually getting richer is that your decisions start to slow down. Not because you're stuck, but because you're no longer reacting. Earlier in life, money decisions feel urgent. You take what's available. You say yes because you need to. Later, something subtle changes. You pause more. You don't jump at every opportunity. You don't feel the same pressure to optimize every pound or every move. And that can feel like you're losing momentum. But you're not. What's actually happening is that you're buying yourself time. Time to think. Time to compare. Time to say no. And time is one of the first things real wealth quietly gives you, even before it feels like wealth. If you've noticed yourself being less rushed with money decisions lately, that's not complacency. That's leverage starting to form. Another sign shows up in what doesn't stress you anymore. There was a point where small unexpected costs could throw off your entire month. Not because you were bad with money, but because there was no margin. So every surprise felt personal. If you've reached a point where those moments still annoy you, but don't destabilize you, something important has changed. Not dramatically, quietly. You don't celebrate it. You don't post about it. You just notice that the floor underneath you feels a bit more solid than it used to. That doesn't feel like getting rich. It feels normal. And that's why people miss it. This is where a lot of people get confused, because none of this feels like success. It just feels less fragile, and fragility is the thing most people mistake for normal. Another sign shows up in what you're no longer trying to prove. Earlier on, money decisions often come with an audience in mind. Not literally, but mentally. You think about how something looks, whether it signals progress, whether it justifies the effort you've put in so far. So you spend in ways that confirm you're moving forward. Not recklessly. Just visibly. At some point, that urge fades. You stop feeling the need to translate your progress into objects or upgrades. You buy things because they serve you, not because they say something about you. And weirdly, that can feel like you're falling behind. Because the external signals slow down. There's less to point at and say, see, I'm doing better now. But internally, something important has shifted. Your sense of security is starting to come from structure instead of appearance, from what you can handle, from what you're no longer worried about. That doesn't feel exciting, it feels quieter. And quiet progress often gets mistaken for no progress at all. If you've noticed yourself caring less about how your money choices look to other people, that's not apathy. That's independence beginning to form. Another sign shows up in how you think about risk. Not financial risk in the abstract. Life risk. There was a time when any uncertainty felt dangerous. A career change. A break. Saying no to something stable without a clear replacement. Those things didn't feel bold, they felt irresponsible. And again, not because you were fearful, but because you didn't have room. When your margin is thin, risk isn't a mindset problem, it's a math problem. But as that margin slowly grows, your relationship with risk changes. You don't suddenly become reckless. You don't start chasing uncertainty for fun. You just stop treating every unknown as a threat. You begin to see the difference between this could go wrong and this would ruin me. That distinction is subtle, but it's massive. If you've reached a point where certain decisions feel possible, even if you don't take them, that's a sign of real progress. Because wealth doesn't remove risk. It reduces the consequences of it. And reduced consequences are what create freedom long before confidence shows up. Another sign is that you're harder to impress. Not cynical, not negative, just less easily swayed. Earlier on, big numbers felt magnetic. Higher salaries, flashy opportunities, stories that sounded like shortcuts. Now, you find yourself asking different questions. What does this require from me? What does it lock me into? What does it quietly make harder to undo? That shift doesn't feel like growth, it feels like hesitation. But it's not hesitation, it's discernment. You're no longer optimizing for maximum upside, you're optimizing for sustainability. And that often looks boring from the outside. If you've noticed yourself turning down things that would have excited you a few years ago, not because you can't do them, but because you don't want what comes with them, that's not stagnation, that's clarity. Another sign appears in how your future feels. Not clearer, just less urgent. There was a time when the future felt like a looming problem you needed to solve quickly. Get ahead, catch up, make something happen before time ran out. When you're early, urgency feels productive, it keeps you moving. But as your foundation strengthens, that urgency softens. You still care. You still plan. You still want more from life. You just don't feel like you're running out of road. And that can be unsettling. Because urgency is familiar. Calm isn't. If your future feels less like a countdown and more like a horizon, something you're moving toward rather than racing, that's not complacency. That's stability starting to do its job. Here's another one people almost always misread. If you're getting richer in a real sense, your progress often feels disconnected from your effort. You work just as hard, sometimes harder, but the improvements don't feel proportional. You don't feel the win immediately. That's because early progress is visible. Later progress is structural. You don't feel it when a dependency disappears. You don't feel it when a future problem quietly gets removed. You only notice when you don't panic. When something goes wrong, and you realize your reaction is different. If you've had moments where you expected to feel stressed and didn't, that's not numbness. That's resilience forming. And resilience doesn't feel like success. It feels like nothing happening. This is where a lot of people get discouraged. Because none of these signs look like getting rich. They don't look like momentum. They don't look like winning. They don't feel like arrival. They feel like less drama, less pressure, less noise. And in a world that equates progress with intensity, that can feel like you're losing speed. But what's actually happening is that your money is starting to work quietly, in the background, instead of demanding constant attention. That's the kind of wealth you don't notice until it's missing. Another sign shows up in how you think about time. Earlier on, time feels expensive. Every hour needs to justify itself. Every gap feels wasteful. You're always slightly aware of what you should be doing. What would be productive? What would move things forward faster? And that pressure doesn't always disappear when you earn more. But if you're actually getting richer in a real sense, something subtle happens. You start to reclaim small pieces of time without guilt. You take a longer walk. You leave a gap in your calendar. You say no to something that would have filled the space automatically before. Not because you're lazy, not because you don't care, but because not every moment needs to be monetized anymore. That can feel wrong at first, almost irresponsible. If you've ever caught yourself enjoying time without immediately justifying it, and then wondered if you should be doing more, that tension is a sign of transition. It means your life is starting to generate enough momentum that it doesn't need constant input to stay upright. And time you don't have to explain is one of the earliest luxuries real wealth creates. Another sign appears in how you react to other people's success. Earlier on, it's hard not to compare. Someone else's progress feels like a measurement of your own. You notice the promotions, the purchases, the milestones you thought you'd hit by now. And even when you're happy for them, there's an undercurrent of pressure. If they're ahead, what does that say about you? But as your position strengthens, comparison loses some of its grip. Not because you stop noticing, but because it stops threatening you. You don't feel the same urgency to keep up. You don't feel behind just because someone else is ahead. You start to understand, not intellectually, but emotionally, that paths diverge for reasons that have nothing to do with winning or losing. If other people's success feels less personal than it used to, that's not detachment. That's security. When your foundation is solid, someone else's progress doesn't shake it. Another sign shows up in how problems land. Not whether they happen, they still do, but how they feel when they arrive. Earlier, problems felt like emergencies. Every issue demanded immediate attention because there wasn't much buffer. So stress was constant, even on good days. But if you're getting richer in a real sense, problems start to shrink. Not because they're smaller, but because you are. You handle them with less emotional swing, less spiraling, less sense that everything else might unravel too. You don't feel heroic about it. You don't even notice it right away. You just realize later that something that would have kept you up at night didn't. If you've noticed that your reaction to setbacks has softened, not in effort, but in panic, that's not numbness. That's capacity. And capacity is what separates stability from survival. The final sign is the hardest to notice, because it feels almost anticlimactic. If you're getting rich in a real sense, you start thinking less about money altogether. Not because you have so much of it, but because it's doing its job. You don't think about it every morning. You don't replay decisions in your head as often. You don't carry it around like a background task that's always running. And ironically, this is the part people miss the most. Because they expect getting rich to feel loud, to feel exciting, to feel like a rival. But what it usually feels like is quiet competence. Money stops being the main character in your life. It becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure is invisible when it works. If money has started to fade slightly into the background for you, not disappear, just quiet down, that's one of the clearest signs that something is actually working. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. If you're really getting richer, it often feels like less is happening. Less drama, less urgency, less emotional volatility. And in a world that equates progress with intensity, that can feel like you're stalling. But you're not. You're transitioning from effort-driven progress to structure-driven progress. From constantly pushing to being supported. That's why so many people miss it. They keep chasing the feeling they were promised. The excitement, the visible reward, and they overlook the quieter signals that matter far more. So if you don't feel rich yet, that doesn't mean you're not getting there. It might mean you're building the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't look impressive in a snapshot. The kind that doesn't give you a rush. The kind that simply makes life easier to carry. And the irony is, by the time money actually feels good, it usually stopped being the point a long time ago.